So, as an agrarian society with limited land mass and limited arable land, clearly this was there was all the seed bear, all the elements for failure was full in there. And yes, and it was also a very socially polarized polity, you would understand. You can imagine that, even at the point of partition, the issue of the unification of the Korean Peninsula was never settled. That means that at different point there's a conflict between nationalist strands, nationalist ideologically driven forces, and a whole lot of mix. Put that also with the economic deprivation and the state of insecurity, then you had a society that was utterly, on its knees, and in many ways low life expectancy. You had a, levels of productivity was way, way, way higher, and all the various economic indicators, several of which has been outlined in the book itself. But just for the purpose of this presentation, I'll just broadly mention them. Economic indicators like life expectancy, GDP per capita. Many of these, broad economic indicators of South Korea significantly lagged behind contemporary countries like contemporary developing countries like, say, Ghana, from Philippines, and all of these ones. They were way ahead of South Korea in terms of that. And even for North Korea was slightly way ahead of South Korea in terms of when you compare the GDP per capita, life expectancy, total productivity. Many of these basic economic indicators was so this was, in terms of, generally speaking, the initial conditions weren't things that really inspired confidence for a state that was being built. Yes. Then I go to the next part of it. I'm going to leadership. As I indicated earlier, we just want to, the book focused primarily on Ri Sing Man and General Park Chung Hee. So I'll start with Ri Sing Man. Ri Sing Man, he was among a few of Korean expatriates that had been trained. He was a Western trained political radical, who had been trusted by the American forces, and he came in to lead the country. And his opposite number up there in Pyongyang, Kim Il Sung, happened to also be for a different ideological orientation, radical in his own way. But Ri Sing Man was a radical anti-communist, with believing in the messianic fervor of getting to defeat communism and reunite the Korean Peninsula and assert the supremacy of Western ideological basis over any other form. So yes, he was a clearly very, very, very radical political operative who had run the country for immediately after partition. And yes, apart from that, also he was a deeply polarizing figure at home. Very he often took decisions and measures that were not, he never really enjoyed broad-based grassroots support. He was kind of an elitist figure thrust into the political process, and so that level wasn't also that he was in some ways detached from the grassroots process. Yes. And we also described him as a mercurial character internationally. The level of his radical inclinations made him often believe in, he was in many ways not a pragmatic figure. He often believed in being able to assert himself. So even as a Washington surrogate, there were times even within back then the Eisenhower administration in some and the House and the Truman White House, where times they were a bit jittery in dealing with a Ri Sing Man for the very fact that beyond the mercurial element, as he was far more militaristic in his worldview, and he was less inclined to engage in non-military approaches to resolving the ideological conflict or the partition of the Korean Peninsula. So in ways that also wasn't quite popular internationally. And given the level of disconnect and his lack of popularity in the country, moreover, he was unable to consolidate the state that was being created. There was that wide divide. I wouldn't also blame him much. I believe that the problems that he had to encounter were multiple, they were legion, and they cut across a whole variety, a spectrum of issues that clearly, without the level of political experience and acumen, it would have been absolutely impossible for a man of his stature to be able to bring things down, bring things under control. So he was among, yes, eventually his regime had to, collapse, and many of his radical views. I must even add that talking about the mercurial element, there are records that show that he was in many ways trying to push Washington to get them to initiate a preemptive strike against North Korea way before the Kim Il Sung was received the approval of Stalin to invade the South. Yes, so Syngman Rhee was presiding over South Korea at the time when the communist North invaded. So his regime wasn't that much of a success, given all the troubles that he had to deal with and the legion of problems that he had to encounter along the way. Yes, now to the heart of it, the leadership of Park Chung-hee, which I must say, a lot of the close to 70% of the content of this book has been dedicated to dealing with the role, the critical decisions that Park Chung-hee implemented to ensure that the country became what it is today. So we spent quite a great deal of time looking at that, and so I'll put it this way: I'll start. General Park Chung-hee, unlike Rhee Syngman, Park Chung-hee was a shrewd military veteran. A man who had cut his teeth in the battlefields of Korea during the Korean War, and prior to that, he also had a great deal of experience in the Imperial Japanese Army. So all of that put together, and he exploited the mess and the state of disorder that was prevalent under the Syngman Rhee, and he led a cohort of generals to upend the democratic process that had been started. And yes, he came in to take power through a military coup d'état. But this was at this point, we had to deal with. I personally had issues with this part of the historical account because if you get it at a time when there were important questions about the United States representing liberal Western democratic ideals and norms, to have a military general step in and come up with a coup d'état. In some ways sounds a bit far-fetched if we don't have the historical account to get an understanding of what were the factors that allowed him to be successful in carrying out such a covert military operation. I say that given the background of what we have, the security condition we have on the Korean Peninsula. The United States and its intelligence network remains an omnipresent force on the Korean Peninsula. So I really had serious doubts with regards to whether the United States was genuinely, and Western benefactors were genuinely opposed to a military coup d'etat and an authoritarian government, or they kind of looked the other way. And one of the constraints, we tried to delve into this part, but the difficulty is that the critical information that you need to fill in this particular space, a lot of it still remains classified. So it's hard to tell the role, whether the United States was a passive or active player in the process of ending either ended the democratic dispensation or being willingly complicit in it. So we haven't been able to establish that, and that remains a critical issue that I had quite a difficulty dealing with, and I'm looking for that's an area that would require greater depth of research to establish what was it that went in that regard. Think about the conflict between the liberal patron of the United States, allowing pseudo nationalists, and the very antithesis of democratic norms upending power. So that was quite an interest. That's something that I was personally really interested in getting to the bottom of. But again, due to the fact that the vital details that we need still